Right. Welcome back, everybody, to Some Kind of Talk on Malazan. And today we're going to talk about sex. And since I know nothing about that, I asked an expert to help me with it because she also knows about the funny sides of things. I am so happy that Quick Jen has agreed to talk with me about this subject. Welcome, Jen. I'll link to your channel below. Tell me something about you, or tell us something about you.
All right. But first of all, thanks. I'm really excited to be doing a collab with you. I appreciate you inviting me on. And I have to laugh. You make one video on Shirk and suddenly you're an expert on.
Well, I don't know.
I am the world's leading zombie pirate sex expert. So yeah, it makes sense.
Definitely. Well, I've been wanting to talk about the depiction of sexuality in the Malazan Book of the Fallen for a while, so I'm glad this is finally happening. So cheers to that.
Cheers.
All right, so let's start with the basics. It's like I feel like there is rather a lot of sexual content, not content, but sex plays a large role in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, unlike in a lot of other fantasy series, I feel, apart from the obviously the romantic and fantasy stuff that also out there that I never read. But apart from that, in your epic fantasy, Malazan has a very specific approach to sexuality, I feel. What do you think about that?
I would agree with you. I think I don't necessarily, I enjoy fantasy, but I don't necessarily consider myself a fantasy reader. So it's not something that jumped out at me the first time I read it. It didn't feel like, gosh, this is a lot of sex for a book. But I think the way he talks about sex, the way it's used in the story is definitely, it's used differently than it is, especially in a lot of fantasies and a lot of novels in general, where the focus tends to be on the romance, yeah, or sometimes explicit sexual description. This is really not either of those things. It's more kind of an exploration of sex from lots of different angles, but it's there, I think, because it's part of the human experience, and that's so much of what he's trying to do with these books is talk about all of the different ways that humans interact, and that can lead to problems or create solutions sometimes as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like that's the other thing. There's a lot of talk and writing about sex in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but there's very, very few scenes, actual sex scenes in the book. It on screen or on the page, there's very, very little actual sex happening, right? And at least it's sort of my experience. When I reread it recently, I feel there's maybe 1 or 2 or 3 scenes where we actually see people getting it on, apart from just talking about it all the time.
Yeah, for the most part, we kind of pick up before or after, or it's implied. And when we don't leave, it's the descriptions are not, to me anyways, I don't find them to be explicit.
No. I mean, even with your favorite zombie pirate sex assassin, even there, I don't think we ever get an explicit Shirk sex scene in the book. We only meet her afterwards or shortly before.
Yeah, there's some negotiation between her and T-Hall about sort of making sure she doesn't poke his eye out with the iron bar beforehand. All right, how is this going to work? But there aren't any, or we'll pick up afterwards and her thinking about it. But no, we're not there for the actual sex scene. At all. So it doesn't.
I feel
I don't remember reading a sex scene that made me uncomfortable.
Well, there is that one. Yeah, I feel sex scenes I've rarely seen done. It's very difficult to do that and just read about people getting it on, unless there's a secondary point to it, I guess, which is why I enjoy, or not enjoy, but appreciate is the better word for it. Like appreciate, for example, what Richard K. Morgan does when he's like, has a very, very explicit gay sex scene in there just to annoy conservative fantasy readers. He's like, it was like literally his point was to show that, like, to make his main character gay and then have him get it on with a lot of people in like very explicit ways and then share all the hate mail he got for it.
It's I think Sarah Waters probably had an opposite reason for doing so, but
yeah,
I don't know if you've read her, but she's another author with a lot of explicit scenes. But
yeah, which one? Sorry,
part of it was Sarah Waters, which is part about sort of that normalizing gay sex. So I think that when it's sort of it's part of the human experience, and when he and so it's there, but it's not explicit in the same way that, you know what, the fact that they're digging latrine, like there's a lot of potty talk too, but he's not giving us explicit scenes of that happening, but it's there, it's recognized as sort of like part of this human experience, especially for soldiers on the march.
I think that's like an important part. There's like a lot of it is basically soldiers on the march having very little to talk about except like different bodily functions, apparently.
Well, we all love a bit of potty humor, so.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. But yeah, so let's look into like what he does, like when he depicts sexuality, how Erikson depicts it compared to other authors, because you already said it's very much about like sex in like relation to relationships and romance. And there's like very little romance in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I would say. I mean, there is definitely, but a lot of the time, like the actual like sex is very much a different thing than romance with Erikson, I feel.
Right. We sort of have, I think typically we see love and sex and relationships or commitment as these three things that sort of are inextricably bound together.
Yeah.
And in these books, they're very much three very separate things that might go together, but they rarely do.
Yeah, that's true. I feel that's actually an important way to go about it, or to look at it, is to actually be able to separate those three things, because it makes talking about each individually and understanding each individually much easier, which would probably help with a lot of the problems that we still have with sexuality in our lives, right? Is that is often like mixed up with like thoughts of commitment and love and whatnot. And that makes talking about it very difficult sometimes, because there's so much baggage with it that shouldn't be there, I guess.
Absolutely. It's I mean, and I think those things, they're connected for a reason. I mean, there's obviously some relation between those three, but that and to a certain extent, a lot of those are sort of something we've created as part of a society, and not and that it's possible to have sex without love and commitment without love and sex. We see that a lot as well in these books. In fact, I was trying really hard before this to think of like a happily married couple in this series.
Well, Torvald, Nom, and Tessera, I would say, are the closest we get to it.
Yeah, so if we look at Torvald and Tessera, though, they have they are committed to each other, but they're not monogamous.
Exactly. That's true. Like another one that I found like very interesting is in that regard is the blend picker relationship, and how it like slowly changes over, or not changes over time, but we learn more about it, because when we meet them first in Memories of Ice, right, they seem to just be like friends, like comrades in the army, and then later on in To All the Hounds, into Rootstown, it's very clear that they are having a relationship that goes way beyond just friends.
Yeah, and I think there were some it first gets raised in Memories of Ice, but we don't really we don't really see it, the depth of their relationship there, because we mostly just sort of see the banter between the
Yeah.
two of them as they observe things going on around them. But yeah, it's not till Toll the Hounds that we really start to understand that this is a serious relationship between the two of them. Although again, I don't know that it's exclusive to the two of them.
Well, it definitely is not. In Toll the Hounds, we see that it definitely is not exclusive.
Right.
In any way. But yeah, I feel that's like something that like Erickson does a lot. It's like when we spoke about it earlier, when you said like what Sarah Waters does, like normalizing things. Erickson does a lot of normalizing sexual, like the appreciation of sexual ideas and so forth with his style of talking about it, because he just like casually shows these things happening in a way and doesn't build it up, like put it on a pedestal or whatever that you see with a lot of like, you know, writing. I feel often you have this point, it's like book happens, interesting stuff happens, then we have like sex scene, and then interesting stuff happens again. And Erickson doesn't do that. He just like lets the sexual thing like run along at the same time as interesting stuff happens most of the time. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, I would agree with that. This sort of it's not this big thing that's led up to, it's sort of just happening all the time. And sometimes we're there for it and sometimes it's not, but it's just sort of implied that this is a regular part of life, right?
Which it is, obviously.
Yeah, yes, but we rarely see that in books. It's either the source of a problem or sort of the culmination of a falling in love, building a relationship storyline, right?
Yeah, which is like super interesting, because like if you make it that much of like the focus of everything without then like talking about it explicitly as just the sexual aspect, but in that like what we said earlier, that like mix of it being sex, love, and commitment, then you kind of what was I going to say? if you like build it in that way, it makes like actually talking about it and thinking about it super difficult, because it's never like, it suddenly is that big focus, even though you never say this is a story just about two people having sex.
If I think I understand what you're saying, it's sort of this like almost this building of expectation so that it becomes more complex and more like, like it needs to be more than maybe what it is, right?
Yeah, exactly that. And I feel we like a lot of books do that and then never actually deliver, because it's impossible to deliver on that, because of the way it's set up in a way.
Yes, I do think, I don't know, I want to talk about sort of how he's framing it in the book, and I want to come back to the gender piece too, because I think that plays into it, and the lack of sexism in Malazan. But I think it's very intentional, this separation of sort of commitment and sex, because when you look at all of the relation, I'm like, we don't have a whole lot of happy marriages, and the few that we do have
are about
tend
other
to not be
things.
exclusive. They tend to not be monogamous relationships. So if you want to include Blend and Picker, as I think they've got a great relationship. Thorvald and Sarah, is it the Kundra war leader? Is it Gaul?
Oh yeah, Gaul with Hanabat as his wife, right?
Yes, and they've got a great relationship. But he's also regularly having sex with men. And so the sex part is really a very separate thing from that like loving, committed marriage that they have, right? For them, this sex is pretty much about creating children and family, because that's what makes their tribe stronger.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, when they have that conversation, it's also about the fact that like both of them are like not exclusive. Like, yes, he's having sex with men, but Hanabat, his wife, definitely also has sex with other men, because we have the discussion whether like her child is actually Gaul's child or not, when she says like, well, you've been squashing your balls on a saddle for 40 years. I'm pretty sure it can't be
Oh,
yours.
that's right. Oh God, yes, I totally forgot about that.
So, yeah.
That's right.
Pretty sure it can't be yours. So yeah, there's that. Like the commitment thing is a very interesting part, because, and that's the point where we get to talk about Ublala for the first time, but not the last time, I guess, today.
Oh yeah, let's
When you have
talk
that,
about Malala.
when we have that glorious scene where Ublala is crying because of the three women whose names I have, Chand, and the other two whose names I just forgot, but the three Islander people that are working with Ublala, so to speak, and they're like taking turns, and Ublana is crying and feels used, and Tehol is trying to explain that he's living the dream of every man, and it just doesn't work that way.
I what I feel like I can't do this without sort of diving into the whole gender thing. Although I will say I love Tehol. I think he's brilliant. I think sexually he's very immature, honestly.
Yeah, of course. And
he likes joking about it. He's super uncomfortable with the actual. I mean, like when it comes down to it, and Shirk's like, "All right, let's do this." He's like, "Oh God, okay."
Which kind of goes with the whole like him being like the student and falling in love with his teacher and everything as well, right? He is.
Yes, he's there's a very much an immaturity with Tehol, but I want to go back to the gender thing, and
Yeah.
I think that we need to talk about this with women and sexuality, with Shirk and Haitan and all of that, but
Yeah.
that he really enjoys using sex as an opportunity to play around with gender stereotypes.
Definitely, yes.
And so here we've kind of got these two stereotypes playing off of each other, and which makes it really fun. And what I particularly like about it is that by playing off of these stereotypes, I think he actually ends up creating a world in which like kind of the relationship between sex and gender more accurately reflects that of our own world than most books do, if that makes sense. Because this idea of wanting sex to lead to love and affection and a relationship is not unique to women. It's not something that only women want, and
No,
when it comes to, I kind of, there's that stereotype, that idea of like all men want a one night stand and all women want a long-term commitment, right? And
no.
in my experience, I'm not just talking like my personal experience, I've got lots and lots of women friends, and we talk about this stuff, that it's kind of 50-50. When you've got two people and one of them is really into it and wants it to go farther and the other one isn't, that gender wise, like it's kind of split down the middle, that it's just as often the man who falls in love and is like, God, I want more, and the woman's like, yeah, I'm not interested, as it is the other way around.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like when you say like that he's using sex a lot to invert like gender stereotypes and gender roles, I think that is like very important, like especially with like characters like Hitan, of course, but here with Ublala as well, because like everyone, you're reducing Ublala to his like physical attribute, that one physical attribute, and like the way he does it in Midnight Tides and Reapers, especially in Midnight Tides, like that he never actually writes the word down. He never calls him biggest dickers. He just like goes, and every time someone starts talking, like everyone is like hush and changes the topic immediately. But he's so big down, and then they switch immediately, which is once again one of those things that like women are objectified, or like physical attributes of women have been objectified for ages, and people talk about it very openly, but very rarely are people like talking that openly about big dicks in a way. Like boobs get mentioned all the time.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking about, is that it happens so much in other books that I don't even think we notice it. And I mean, to be fair, I think that's something that's changed in recent years, but I mean, it's still there. Absolutely. This that descriptions of women's breasts or desirability being related to the size of their breasts
Yeah.
is something that's constantly referred to, whether obliquely or directly, in books and movies and TV.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of fun to see it happen to, and maybe that's the wrong word. I just said, boy, it's fun to objectify men, but what it does is it makes us step back and look at,
Yeah.
it makes us look at something with new eyes, because if it had been a woman in his place, it wouldn't have registered because we're so used to it, right? But you
Exactly. Yeah.
have it happen to a man and it sticks out. You remember it because he's reversed it.
That's it. I mean, there's like one or two women in the series that are described in a similar way, like Malazan, for example, being one of them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's never as explicit as it is with Ublala Pang. And the
Well,
thing is, like, I guess I would not have noticed it with Malazan unless I thought about how it usually happens in a lot of books. And for that, we need to have like shift it to a man to make it like jarring, so we actually notice, and then hopefully sit back and think about it, how it is like done in a lot of other books.
yes, she's that's a perfect like Malazan essentially is sort of this female Oblala, although she's not really at all, but that really we have the same thing sort of happening to both of them.
Yeah.
But it hits different with Malazan.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I guess the other part is that she is very much conscious of the fact and at ease with it, whereas Ublala, at least at the beginning, doesn't really get it, and later on, that's like something that I find interesting, that when you compare Ublala in Dust of Dreams or Crippled God to Ublala in Midnight Tides, he becomes something of a sex addict himself after a while.
He does, and I think he's so used to being wanted that he's never learned how to deal with not being wanted, I guess. This sort of assumption, which God, and so now it veers into sort of a different storyline. There's sort of something like we're going for a different moral's not the right word, but you know what I mean? There's sort of a different point to that storyline with him in the those last two books, because it's definitely sort of not about him being objectified
anymore. No, it has that great line with like when Draconis is giving relationship advice to Ublala, which I so love, that sense, like courting is the art of growing like mold on the one you want.
and he kind of ends up doing that, doesn't, or he wears her down. And I do wonder if there's this correlation of sort of like being so used to just sort of accepting that everyone wants to have sex with you, that there isn't this understanding of how to deal with it when, you know, sometimes someone doesn't.
I guess, I mean, yeah, that's definitely a thing. And there's like, certainly, especially, I'm not sure if it's like the same thing with women, but it's definitely a thing that you see with like very overconfident guys that then totally don't understand that no means no, obviously, and people actually maybe don't want sex with them. It's certainly built into this like whole masculine culture, has been built into it for a while, like for ages. It's slowly changing, or so I hope.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's talk about like more like yeah, Hitan is a good character that we should talk about, and her like sexuality in Memories of Ice, I would say, is like her sexuality in Memories of Ice is definitely more interesting to talk about than Dust of Dreams. I mean, Dust of Dreams has a lot of interesting things also to talk about, but like her open display of sexuality in Memories of Ice, I feel, is a very interesting aspect. Might have been like the first book in the Malazan series where I realized that it has a very unique unique, but a very specific approach to sexuality when we have that trip with Gruntle and Harlow and Stoney and Hetan and her two brothers when they meet up on the road, and then later on when she tries to get to Itkovian and so forth. Because she
Yeah,
has like a yeah. You go ahead.
well, I think so. We have this sort of switching of the genders, but there's that also leads to some humorous situations, and that's something I've heard talked a lot about. Sort of like, why is that scene with Heitan? It's funny, and the same with Lala when he's like, I want a sex shirk. Like, there's humor there too, and I think. Oh, I just realized I already talked about this in the shirk video, really, but that part of that just comes from him doing something so unexpected, and there is humor to that, but there's also it also serves a purpose, because the reason there's humor is that people are behaving in a way contrary to what we've come to expect.
Yeah.
And having these little humorous scenes also sort of opens the door for us to like go farther down that path of why is it so unexpected, right? It also kind of raises this idea of attitudes towards sex being very much connected to culture. Because I think Heitan is she clearly enjoys sex. She's clearly not shy about pursuing it. But I also think that it's a reflection of the Barghast culture as well, right?
Yes, because we have that scene in Memories of Ice when Trotz has his duel and they're like celebrating there, and like all these Barghast women just randomly grabbing Malazan soldiers and dragging them into their tents. So it is part of the Barghast culture, but Heitan is obviously like very vocal about it when she like promises to get Krupp and stuff like that, or Itkovian, and talks about it in that way, which once again, yes, is inverting like gender stereotypes in a way, because you have a lot of guys talking about like conquests, so to speak, and like their goal of getting that or that person into bed, and like probably women do that as well, I'm pretty sure. But it's never like mentioned in like popular culture, and like a lot of guys would probably feel like super threatened by the fact that maybe everyone is behaving that way, because it kind of takes away that feeling of power in a way when you decide that you want to get someone into bed. It's like you deciding, you making that choice, and you doing everything and so forth. Whereas if someone else does that to you, it can give you like a feeling of like powerlessness, obviously, which with Heitan is very obvious when she tries to hunt down Krupp, for example. I feel.
I would never describe Krupp as powerless.
Of course not. Of course not.
But yeah, I think to a certain extent, what we see is with Heitan and the men she interacts with is sort of that clash of cultures is a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
That Malazan may be a sexism-free world, but that doesn't mean that gender and sex don't play into interactions and expectations. They absolutely do, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so that the people she's coming on to, they too are surprised, which feels a little bit backwards given sort of this world he's created. But I personally think that Darujistan and a lot of the Janabakis societies are probably a little closer to I don't know, to say our own, but like the cultural norms I've grown up with than a lot of the other cultures in this world.
I mean, Darujistan has that like more like a classic like fantasy city feel in general, with all the like the trappings that we know from like your classic sword and sorcery stories and like your old school tabletop role-playing game settings in a way. which kind of makes sense. But you have like that. There is some sort of sexism definitely in, or like very firm gender roles in there, but which is what we see in Toll the Hounds with Charlize Stahl. Now, whatever, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that even starts in Gardens of the Moon, where really her the most important thing she has to do in her life is decide who to marry. Like
Exactly.
that's really the most important sort of, I guess, accomplishment, the defining aspect of her life is making that decision who she's going to marry. And that's,
well, apparently she
that's
gets
very
to
much
decide.
classic fantasy of the men vying for her attention, and and the idea being that really that's her, like once she's picked out her guy, like that's it, she's good for the rest of her life, no more.
Yeah, which is terrible, but at least she gets to decide, and it's not her parents that decide whom she is going to marry. So there's that aspect of it. But after that, yes, we see her
we
like
could be more regressive, absolutely.
I'm not saying we should. It's just like there's at least some light there already. But yes, especially with like Toll the Hounds, we see her struggling with that role, which is basically just she's a trophy wife, basically. It's like for him, like, because he doesn't even have like an interest in her. And her then using sexuality to kind of break out of that in a way, which obviously doesn't work.
Is it Gorlas? Is that
Gorlas? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and so I think part of the bumping up against between Hitan and this particular group of people is that they are coming from very different cultures and approaches to relationships and sex, and the role of women. And there's even a point, and it's one of the things that does genuinely bother me in these books is where Stani calls her, like, I don't remember, but it's something like a slut or a slag or something like that, right? For dragging the men off. And we know that that's kind of based in jealousy, but that that we have one woman sort of denigrating another woman for being sexually active. And so again, I'm gonna come back to the idea that I just think Darujah Stan and Jenna Bacchus in general is a little more aggressive when it comes to sex. And so we have this conflict, but I will say, because I've heard, this is something that I've heard discussed and sort of attacked a lot, this idea that like what Hitan is doing is not okay, that if she were a man, she'd be run out of town, that sort of thing. And I think that it's really important to make that distinction between like sexual aggression is the right word, and consent. That at no point are we led to believe that any of these men declined her, except for at Kovian, and she doesn't
get him,
have sex with him.
No,
right? Not for lack of trying, but this isn't,
Yeah, I mean, she does definitely. She's very aggressive about it, yes, but yeah, what you said, there is always consent. Now, there's certainly a point where I would say she could have taken no for an answer a bit earlier, but I feel especially with Edkovian, at some point it becomes like a game almost between those two, where Edkovian kind of waits. It's more for her goal at some point, I don't think, is actually to get him into bed. It's more like actually to make him uncomfortable and push up against his like vows and stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's part of it, but I also feel like, again, when we look at a gender stereotypes, that that reversing it helps us see it in a new light, this sort of like that continually pushing and coming back and not taking no for an answer. Like, that's something I think every woman is familiar with. Right. And so the fact that it sort of becomes uncomfortable, it's also a way of helping us sort of look at things in a new light.
Definitely. And I mean, like the argument that like if she were a guy, she would be run out of town. People that make that kind of argument are the kind of people who are just I would say uncomfortable with the fact that men are finally called out for shitty behavior and can't stand that. So they're like, oh, but look, she's doing the same thing. We're no longer allowed to do that, but she is. And it's a terrible argument. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, yes, it is. It absolutely is. And I also want to point out that this is fiction, and yes, we care about these characters and we're attached and we're fully invested in this world, but that one of the most important things fiction does is allow us to explore things like this in a safer environment. That's not the real world, right?
Yeah. Plus, no one ever said that Hetan is a truly through and through good character, morally good character. She's not. I mean, because there are very, very few absolutely good or evil characters in the Malazan universe. And she certainly is not one of those people. Itkovian might be, but even he isn't really. So yeah, she's just like very aggressive in a lot of ways, like not only in the sexual way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have lots of characters like that in the book. Mm-hmm. So I think, gosh, there's so many different ways we could go. I'm trying to decide where we want to end up next, but something I was thinking about when we talked about Gardens of the Moon, or when I was talking about Chalice and Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
That I think the portrayal of gender and women in that first book are a big part of what got me hooked and pulled in. Mm-hmm. One of our very first scenes is with Tattersail.
Oh, and yeah. So
we've got this woman who is older, overweight, powerful, and sexually active. And I can't remember the last time I saw a character like that portrayed anywhere. And not just sexually attractive or sexually active, but attractive to others. Right?
Yeah.
That we don't have just, it's not just the Malazan Galanis that are.
Yeah. And I think that's like something that we see a lot with like the Malazan books in general. I've said it before, like what Erikson does so well is describe mature characters, because that's something that we rarely see in fantasy in general. Like the only old people are usually like wizards and maybe dwarves, and they're like super old and shit. But
and when with women, I mean, because the characters you just described, most of those are men.
Yeah, but with women is even more. We only see like either like old witches or magical creatures, like I don't know, your Galadriel or whatever. Although she might actually be like a good example for like the positive side of it. But apart from that, most characters in fantasy books, no matter what gender, are young a lot. Most of them are also men, but that's like, that's another problem.
So it's really refreshing to see that. And it also, he separates this idea of, so I'm going to throw another one in there because we sort of had this love, sex, commitment thing, attraction.
Yeah.
That isn't something solely reserved for young and beautiful people.
No, definitely not.
That all kinds of people are attracted to all kinds of people. And we know that, we see that in the real world, and yet we so rarely see it portrayed in fiction. Right? Or especially I think in movies and television and in film more than even fiction, but constantly bombarded with this idea that all of these things, this sex, love, commitment stuff is also tied up with sort of this young, being young and beautiful, and that we rarely see these kinds of stories that actually reflect the sort of relationships that we see and have in our own lives.
Yeah, I remember like a while ago, I read like an interview with some actress, I have forgotten who, because it's not really important. And she was saying that like the time she turned like 40, she only got offers to play like really old women, because you either play like people in their 20s, or you, as a woman in movies, you're either in your 20s, like kids, and then like early, like young adults, all the way up to, I don't know, your vague mid-20s, and then suddenly you have gray hair and are old. But that
well,
whole
you know what, you're a mother, and so you have 40-year-old women being
yeah.
the mother of 30-year-old men.
Yeah, well,
Which is, I guess, another role when we were talking about it. So yeah, you can be a witch or a mother, I think,
yeah.
are your options once you hit a certain age.
Yeah, and that's like something that Erickson in general does a lot, is like show people like actual, like realistically people in like their 30s, 40s, and whatnot. I mean, Tattlesale is obviously much older because she's like a sorceress and knows like
Right.
spells and shit, but but still, like like also like Torvald and Tissera, they're also older.
Or we get Sandalath and Withel, right?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. That's another
got
one.
like a
Yeah.
nice geriatric love story in there.
But yeah, because that's a fact of life. But I mean, we are no longer living in Middle Ages where people die when they're like 40. Most of our life happens after we're 20. So it's fascinating that that is usually not like actually reflected in the media that we consume.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think that set it was a nice starting point into this world and its approach to gender and sexuality, having Tattersall come in and
Be Tattersall.
sort of you set the stage for us, I think.
Yeah, she definitely does, and she's a very, very good like point, because we have like her as a viewpoint character there with all like the things around that, and she's sexually active when it starts already, because we know she's, I mean, isn't it like the first scene?
It's when she's standing on the battlefield, and it would go very quickly into that flashback, I think, and then
the flashback starts with
like
her
before
being
the
in bed.
battle starts with her in bed with
Or the sorcerer who dies
immediately.
immediately.
And again, I don't think it's explicit, but it's sort of implied that they've just had sex or woken up after having had sex. It's very clear that this is a sexual relationship, and she does talk about that despite later realizing that she has deeper feelings for him, that for her this had kind of, she'd explicitly said that this is just a sexual relationship.
Exactly.
That this is an army, that they're camped out, they're on the march there, and so these soldiers are going to find a way to get their needs met in the same way they need to eat, and they need that we know that they're also having sex. They're also constantly hooking up.
I think that's like another thing that you get there because of it being military fantasy, and it's something in a different way. You see that in the Black Company as well, but the fact is these are extreme circumstances, which is why I always like defend the Malazan book when people criticize it for not having a lot of like good romances. It's like, yeah, those people are fighting wars all the time. They have like very little time to have like a proper everyday kind of romance. That's not what's happening, because those people are in extreme circumstances all the time. Which reduces a lot of stuff to just like physical needs, and those are eating and drinking and getting it on. That's just like because they're like grown-up people with those needs.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think that like Malazan, like, yes, it's fantasy, but it's also he's using this world as a place to explore very real issues and to sort of tear the veil away from a lot of the ideas we have. And so sort of this gauzy, soft focus idea of romance, it doesn't have a place here because ultimately it's a manufactured thing. It doesn't really have a place in the real world either.
That's true.
Right?
Of course not.
That this idea we've gotten from movies and books is not actually what love and romance is like in the real world.
Mostly.
And if it is, honestly, half the time it's calculated. It feels manipulative. Right?
Of course. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so he's gonna tear that away, and we're gonna actually look at like, how do people interact and how do they end up in bed together? And most of the time it's not because
Yeah.
the guy showed up at her doorstep with, you know,
Yeah. Although I've heard
kept
that
her off her
happen.
feet.
I've,
It's sort of a combination of like right place, right time. Yeah, let's do this, right? That he's not interested in perpetuating these false ideas, I guess.
exactly.
Um, and, but it also, for the most part, the characters we're looking at, it doesn't make a lot of sense within the context of their lives as well.
Yeah. Although, like an
Um,
interesting thing that I found recently with the Malazan books or Erickson's writing in general is like, even though he just tears away that, as you just said, like all like couples that actually stay together longer are suddenly married. They're all husband and wife. Like Withal and Sanderlath, when do they marry? Who marries them? How does that happen? But
I think
suddenly
they
they're
just,
all husband and wife.
yeah, I think they just decide. Do you think Megora and Iskerl had a lovely ceremony?
Well, those two, I have no idea how they even ended up together. You know.
Oh, I don't either. I feel like there's something there. There's always something more going on underneath the surface with
With
Iskerl.
the,
But
yeah,
again, that's another example of sort of where we see commitment. We do not then see the love or the sex, right?
yeah.
Not that he's terribly committed either.
Well, I guess he's kind of committed in this like weird way.
He should be committed, but that's not all I can, because he goes pretty hard after the priestess in Pull the Hound.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But doesn't it like end up with them like having this like a three-way relationship or something at the end? I feel it's like this.
Oh God.
Yeah.
I don't remember now. That
when
might
it
have made, all right. If I when I said there weren't any sex scenes that made me uncomfortable, if that's the case, I'm taking that back.
well, it's not described. We just have him like trying to rewrite the Book of Shadows to make sure that the high priest can have more than one wife.
Yes, yes.
But that's the point. He says like more than one wife. So he won't like get rid of Megora. He just wants to have more.
Yeah. Well, you just never know with this girl because he's plotting to. There's a point where he's plotting to get rid of her, like kill her off, and I think in part that's mostly for humor. Same with like Withel and Sandilath, where you get the impression they kind of remind me of my grandparents, where there's like constant bickering, and yet they love each other so much.
I mean, like the Withal and Sanderlath thing, I feel it gets very dark in Dust of Dreams. I feel like when she's like slowly losing her mind, and now finally reading Carcanas is like showing like how much trauma that girl has gone through, even before we meet her. Like
a lot of compassion for her, doesn't it? I had a very hard time with her turning Corlett away. And yeah, this definitely sort of gives you new perspective and compassion for her.
Yeah.
But I actually, despite the fact that it's something of an arranged marriage, I think they have the story of their relationship is great. And it's also, it's heartbreaking. And it does, when I was kind of made a joke about geriatric relationships, but it does feel like that. And they're both older. They're both much more realistic about their expectations of relationships. But then we also have sort of this pain and loss that comes with the other person slowly losing their mind, which often happens with senility or Alzheimer's or things like that as couples get older. And it's just heartbreaking, which is not about sex, this is not a fun topic. Let's move on.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on. Yeah, because this is like a different thing. So who else is like very
all right, so I'm going to add one more thing to the gender stuff just because I think it's great, and it's such a really lovely snapshot of sort of this sexism free world. Is there's a point in Bone Hunters as they're marching towards Egatan, you get a lot of these great little scenes where we just sort of start to really get to know the squads and how they interact. And we have Smiles well, I mean, she's being insane, but there's this idea of we have Smiles like bragging about sexual conquests of her past,
Yeah,
and saying that
which
nobody
all
here is
never
good enough
happened,
for
but
her,
yeah,
while everybody else is teasing her and
yeah,
saying, yeah, like, I bet they're all made up, or it was your cousin or something like that, right?
yeah,
And to me, like, you put a young, like an 18-year-old boy in that
yeah.
conversation, and
They would still mostly be made up, but
no, yeah, but it would be exactly the same. This sort
of
of
course,
like
yeah.
the way she talks about it and the way they treat her really has absolutely nothing to do with gender.
No, nothing at all. That's true.
And it was
Uh,
great.
yeah, I mean, to look at like another character where we have that like weird like tangle of sex and love and commitment, I guess, is that couple of Hellion and Herb, right?
Mm, yeah, they're a complicated one. Um,
Definitely.
and yet so God, I mean, as ridiculous as it was when they finally hook up in the middle of the last battle, it
Yeah.
was so satisfying.
Yeah,
Uh,
definitely. But even before, you have that one scene in Reaper's Gale where Hellion is once again like drunk and says like, Herb, come, I need someone to roll with right now. And Herb's like, I can't believe this. And the others are making jokes that they should be quiet because they don't want to hear that. Like everyone in that army knows that Herb is like fully in
everyone
love with
except
her.
Hellion.
Yeah, everyone except Hellion, of course.
And you get glimpses of her feelings, like through the drunken haze, you get glimpses of her feelings for Herb, which I think then come into focus as she's slowly forced to stop drinking
Yeah, yeah,
as they cross the desert. Which is why it's so great to see them come together at the end. But
yeah,
I think that's another thing you see, even though I can't think of another example. I know it happens more than just in that, where sort of when you have a character that really like does have deeper feelings, them not wanting to have that kind of quick roll in the hay,
yeah,
right? Um,
yeah. There's a few, I guess, but it's not that many.
it's because it definitely complicates things, but it once again is sort of that separation of the feelings and the sex. Unless I'm
Yeah.
remembering wrong, but I don't think they don't hook up at all, right? Like she comes on to him, but they don't actually have sex before that, do they? I thought
I
she was
don't think,
just
because something happens. I guess she
I thought
just
it was
like,
just like unsuccessful sex with skull death mostly.
yeah, yeah, definitely the unsuccess. Yeah, because we have that scene when she's trying to come onto Herb, but I guess she just passes out because she's
Is
that
that
drunk at that point.
that that tracks? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
it's just
Skull Death is
so
another
big.
like
It's hard to remember
interesting.
all the details, so I have to go based off of like vague feelings and impressions of some events.
Yeah, yeah, but like that's like the other thing, right? Skull Death is another like super fascinating character there, with like the whole idea of purity, sexuality, and him like, and also like gender questions, obviously, because he thinks of himself apparently as a like because of his duty as being the last prince to actually marry a princess and get like kids and stuff like that. But yeah, he's he's actually gay, but he's very much not accepting it, I guess, for a while at least.
Yeah. So, which is interesting in that, like when we talk about like LGBTQ representation in these books, I think first of all, I think especially for the time when it was written, it did an excellent
Yeah,
job. I think there was a lot more in there than I was used to seeing in fantasy books, and that it was handled more sensitively than when I have seen it in fantasy books. It's often sort of this like titillating, look, girls are hooking up sort of thing, right?
yeah,
Um, and and here it really is treated with respect and with real relationships, except that I do think we see reflected in these books sort of that cultural squeamishness towards sex between men,
yeah,
like that's viewed differently than sex between two women is.
Yeah.
I love that in this world, like for the most part, in fact, I think pretty much across the board, people's reactions to characters being gay is like, it just
They don't
doesn't even
care.
matter. It's not a big deal. It's
Yeah,
nothing.
like,
Like, yeah, okay, that's a
yeah,
normal, right? But when we look at actual gay relationships, that we see a lot of open female relationships, and we don't see the same with men. We see school death. We
yeah,
have gall. And there's a captain in the Bone Hunters who is he's like attacking he's talking to one of the heavies, and he's sort of like talking derogatorily about skull death.
yeah.
And keeps asking all these questions about him, like what's his deal, but like really, can he really
Oh,
fight
yeah,
all of
yeah.
this? And then it turns out that like he's actually attracted to skull death,
I think that's
right?
is it Gontai? I think it's Gontai.
Yes, Gontai, thank you.
But he's annoying as fuck in general.
Yeah, but again, we have this, like, he's being very circumspect, and it sort of feels like this, like he's putting on this sort of bravado, this manliness, and
Yeah,
trying to sort of hide his true intentions.
which is a very realistic depiction. Like, I mean, that's something that happens,
It
unfortunately, way too often.
absolutely is a reflection of our world.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of the areas where we don't see him flipping that reflection to let us look at it from a different viewpoint, I guess.
Yeah,
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's true. Although I must say, I really enjoy the fact of Gaul having sex with men, because he is that like war leader, and like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of like everyone knows it in a way. And this is like, because to have someone, because oftentimes, like in our world, it's still a big deal for like leaders or like public figures to be openly homosexual. I remember like in Germany, it was like a decade ago, when the mayor of Berlin, which is, well, it's Berlin, right? The mayor of Berlin had to like, he had like a public coming out before, like when he was running for like the mayorage thing, because he was running for mayor, and he made like a public coming out, because like, I don't want like someone leaking that later on to use it against me in like the campaign. And that was like the first like major political figure to actually come out openly as gay. And that's in like 2005 or 6 or whenever that was.
No, and it was a very big deal. I think like when, I mean, here in America, when these books were written, like gay marriage was not legal anywhere. Like it's things, a lot has changed in the world since these were written. And I think sometimes too, I can't think of specific examples right now, but it's something that comes up for me when I read criticisms of these books and its approach to sexuality, particularly like representation. Is that I think all books need to be seen to a certain extent as a historical artifact of the time in which they were written.
And I feel it's like, especially with like representation and like question of gender representation and sexuality, a lot has changed in the last decade, maybe more, even like 6 or 7 years. And that's something that reflects a lot. Like, you know, you have like usually like some aspect of life changes all the time, but it shifts. Sometimes it's like race related, sometimes it's like, or like ethnicity related, sometimes it's gender related, sometimes it's something else, like, you know, work equality or whatever. And like the last couple of years, like maybe last decade, has been very much about sexuality and gender representations and gender roles and stuff like that. So that is the part that starts to feel dated when you read the Malazan book at the forum, because that's just like, time has changed so much in that regard.
Yeah, and yet, oh my gosh, it was like practically revolutionary at the time it was written, because like nobody else was doing that in fantasy. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
these real representations
Yeah.
of women, and I know that we certainly don't have a 50-50, but particularly for sort of a military focused fantasy novel, to have so many women, in such a variety of positions within the society, and to have them, I just run the gamut in terms of personality and characteristics, and just be human instead of some female archetype one way or another.
True.
Is huge. And so
definitely,
like I think it's really important to remember that, which is not to say that I don't think that there's not a lot in here that I find problematic necessarily. It's more that I bet if he were to write this today, it would be different. He would write it differently because
things have changed and he's a different person now.
Yeah, exactly.
I recently had like a debate on that. I don't want to go too deeply into it, like a conversation about in Dust of Dreams, the hobbling. I don't want to go into the hobbling as such, but the point was that the hobbling, and he has like Erickson has made written an essay on why he put it in there and so forth, which is like we need to hear we should not turn away from like terrible cruelty and all that stuff, which is totally correct, and I agree with him there. But the point is that what he didn't take into account at the time, because it wasn't a thing at the time, not even in 2014 when he wrote that essay about it, is the idea that it may just really trigger and traumatize people who have had personal experiences in that regard. Because 5 years ago, we were not like, at least outside of like the very, very, very like internet part of like, I don't know, TikTok, which didn't exist at the time, but maybe Twitter or something, we weren't thinking about triggering people. It was just not on our like radar as a society to think about that kind of thing.
Yes, I agree. And I think that I believe in trigger warnings.
Yeah, me too.
Do not believe in not looking at difficult or uncomfortable things because they may trigger things. So because I mean, when we talk about trauma and triggers, that's certainly not something that is solely limited to rape or assault.
Of course not.
Suicide might be a trigger.
Yeah.
Like trails of suicide in fiction might trigger something, or the loss of a child, or there are all kinds of traumas and there are all kinds of triggers.
Yeah.
And so allowing people to know that ahead of time and then make the choice to either not read that or to find out like which chapters do I need to skip when I'm reading this sort of thing. I think that's absolutely appropriate. But I also think that art is a way of working through trauma.
Yeah.
Whether it's the act of for some writing about it or for others reading about others who have gone through the experience. And the other piece is that the majority of us have not gone through that sort of trauma. And fiction is a way for us to put ourselves in the shoes of those who have and gain insight and empathy.
Exactly. Exactly.
It can be a call to action as well.
Yeah, it is, like, especially with like the Malazan Book of the Faun. I feel people who are not reading the Malazan Book of the Faun as a call to action are totally missing the point. This is not a book that those are not books that should just entertain us. Those are books that should make us do something and make the world a better place. That's kind of the goal there. But I agree with you, like the trigger warnings make a lot of sense, because on like the other thing is not showing something is taking away the agency of those people. You want people to make an informed and conscious decision to either go relive some kind of trauma or work through some kind of trauma, but you don't want to just coddle them away from it. That's disrespectful towards people who may be triggered. You want to give them the chance to do what they want to do.
Hey, Raf, do you have a light there?
Do
you have a light?
I don't know.
You can turn on?
No.
No, that's okay. That's all right. You're in the shadow, and so I can't see your face, but it's fine. I just thought if you had a light, you could turn it
on. No, I'm like this. Oh, the sun just moved around because I'm on my balcony.
No,
the
that's
sun
okay.
Just moved around. Wait a second.
It's a striking silhouette.
Does this help? Because now.
Yeah, you see a little bit. You're off. All right, how do I, like, you're to the left of the, there you go. You're in the middle.
All
There we
right,
go.
perfect. Just move the camera to the other side so the light comes in from a different angle.
All right, sorry. I just, anyways, I
Yeah.
realized that I wanted to,
Trigger warnings and stuff.
yeah, so I do think that's important, but I also think that when I mean, we don't have to go into this because I think Erickson has talked about this and said it very explicitly and better than either of us ever could, that there is value in talking about things that make us uncomfortable.
Of course, we need to.
And read, yes. And that the alternative is to turn a blind eye.
Exactly.
Which really does go against, like you said, everything that these books are about.
Well, I turn a blind eye to almost everything every day, but that's
well, all right. It's a phrase. Come on.
I know. I know. But see, like, I feel like, yes, to bring it back to like more like sexual topics and not to go to too deeply into the trigger
I'm going to
thing.
throw one more thing out there.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
when it comes to this question of kind of the hobbling and the bitathol and also the Jonathan torture stuff that Ruth and Bad did a trio of videos on it that are brilliant. I know not everybody's going to agree with them, but like if that's something people are interested in, I think he kind of made the definitive Malaz 2 videos on those topics. They're great. So
yeah, I agree, but I would also suggest to also watch the one that Claudia did on
the response to
that one is like really important to watch as well, because she has like a very, very specific point that I feel is important. But yeah, but let's go back to like the depiction of sexuality with Malazan. I want to go back to Letherus, because I feel like that's like the other thing that like once we come to Midnight Tide and to Letherus, that's sort of where like Erickson really turns on the heat in like sexuality with Ublana, but also like the weird tension with Rocket and Tel in also in Reaper's Gale, obviously. Stuff like that, I feel is that he suddenly does something that I feel a lot of fantasy doesn't do, because a lot of fantasy writing is very prudish in a way. Even your George R. Martin, who is like very much about like having gratuitous sex scenes in there, it still has like a very prudish way about it, whereas with especially the depiction of sexuality in Letherus, it's just like front and center in a way that it is in our world. Like, right, you can't like switch on your computer without running across, if not porn, then at least, you know, some kind of ad campaign that like sexualizes women to the point of like insanity. And Letherus is just in the same, is just that way, where like sexuality is just like the people are very, very open about those things, right?
Yeah, I think so, but I also feel like there's sorry, I'm this just occurred to me, so now I'm trying to think if there are other scenes in other books that contradict what I'm thinking. But I'll put it out there, and then when you think of contradictions, let me know. Because I also feel like there's a certain like repression there as well, if that makes sense, like this sort of obsessed, and yet I know oh god, think of Tanal Yafanar and how much like there's this this how do I put this, like this weird like sex is everywhere, and yet it's so people are so uncomfortable with it and sort of have this
which is exactly
it's constant conflict between like these Puritan values and feelings and this like explicit in your face all the time, no big deal, and also in particular the commodification of sex. And that's where I was coming, that's where I was trying to think of like where else we see, I know it has to exist because it's not unique to them, but like where we have like a very organized brothel and prostitution in the same way that we do leather.
Because we rarely spend enough time in like a city apart from like Letteras, only in the Ruzhistan, and there's the focus is not on that in the Ruzhistan. But we have like the mention with Korik that he grew up outside of Lihang, I think.
Yeah.
With prostitutes. So
yeah,
there's
that's right.
yeah. So that obviously happens all the time, but it's like Letteras is just very explicit about. I think you're right about like it's everywhere where people are so uncomfortable and kind of repressed about that weird mix of puritanical culture and like over sexualization, which, you know, once again is something we face a lot. Like we're talking about sex now for like the last hour and a bit or whatever, and YouTube would totally never monetize this kind of content because because of whatever. but it's at the same time it's totally fine to have like super sexualized thumbnails, and that's something YouTube doesn't do anything against, which once again, why would you? But still, like that weird like double standard kind of thing is very much a real world issue right now, which I guess is exactly a puritanical thing because it's very much an American thing as well.
Right, that this idea of like pretty straightforward conversation about something that is a big part of most people's lives it makes you uncomfortable, whereas sort of this, like I said, the commodification and the objectification of sex is something that we've completely accepted without question. Or maybe not without question, but it's pervasive.
It's pervasive, but I think the other part of that is that like the commodification and objectification, they dehumanize it. So it's very much easier to accept that because we don't think about it as a human thing. We kind of compartmentalize there, I guess. It's like we think about our personal sexuality in a different way than we think about seeing all those half-naked people on ad posters and whatnot, because those are different things. They're just like objects, and I feel that's sort of how we as society deal with it.
I think, God, I think you kind of hit on one of the reasons. I mean, I was excited I would have collabed with you on just about any topic, but why I was particularly excited about this topic is because there's this desire to push back against sort of a lot of criticism or discomfort with this, or questioning, why do we have to talk about these things? Why do we have to look at these things? Like, why does it need to be in there at all? When it's so pervasive in other areas, and I don't understand what it is about these books that makes people uncomfortable, because for me it was refreshing, and I don't remember feeling discomfort, and I was surprised to find how many people did. And I'm setting sort of the rape and assault things aside because that's not sex, right? I'm solely talking about portrayals of sex and relationships and all of that within the books. That it's sort of this is exactly why it's important. The fact that we can't talk about these things allows the negative aspects and impacts to continue unheeded, right?
Exactly.
I'm going to go back to like when I was raised, it was very much like sort of this colorblind thing.
Yeah.
We're all colorblind, race doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
And so I really did grow up thinking that race was not important. The problem with that is that when you have a whole generation, like people who aren't experiencing it firsthand, growing up believing that racism is something that happened in the past, then institutional racism and individual racism is allowed to continue unimpeded because nobody is looking at it and nobody is talking about it.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's the same thing with sex, definitely. And it's super fascinating when you look at like how things have changed in a way, when you look at like every decade, and like how, I mean, it's a good thing that we are more sensitive about these things nowadays in like public discourse, but it also tends to overshoot in a way where like this is making me uncomfortable. I don't want to read that. It's like, maybe like if it's really making you uncomfortable to read about sexuality, then don't do that. But if it's just making you like a little bit squeamish, then maybe read it and then think about why it is making you squeamish and what's the problem there, and figure out if it's like a problem with you or the writing.
Right.
And both is possible.
There's a big difference between a trigger and discomfort, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that discomfort is often something that is there because there's something that you need to work through, that there's value in working to the other side of figuring out, where does this discomfort come from?
Yeah, definitely. It's like, I mean,
and that is one thing these books are very good at, I think, is
yeah,
putting you in a position of discomfort.
I think that's like something that puts Malazan more on like the side of literary fiction, although, you know, Erickson kind of hates that term and whatnot. But the point is that in literary fiction, and I've read not a ton of it, but I've read like some, you know, Thomas Pynchon and some Cormac McCarthy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And especially Pynchon goes overboard with like really like explicit depiction of like really weird sexual behavior. Sometimes it does a lot of that. And in those parts of like the literary field in general, it's kind of accepted. You take that just and run with it or not, or just don't read those books. But fantasy has for a long time been very much about not challenging readers. It's very much like the escapism part of it, which I like the escapism, it's cool. But it's been very much about fan service and making people happy and not challenging their beliefs or thoughts for a long time. And that's something that, you know, modern fantasy writers definitely do, at least some of them do. But it's still, you have a large part of fantasy readers that are used to just having like fan service books and not being challenged in their reading and like in their assumptions when they pick up a book. And I guess that's sort of what Erickson does a lot. There is like challenge people. He's not there to make you. I think he has explicitly said that he's not writing escapist fiction. He wants you to think and not just to lean back and enjoy.
Yeah. I would agree with you, and there is the escapism part, but I also think the best fantasy is about sort of reflecting our world back to us, like allowing us to work through and digest certain things. But I know maybe that's more sci-fi. Actually, I think sci-fi is better than that. And so it may be that yeah, if you've only read fantasy and you're coming into these books, particularly if you've only read more classic fantasy,
yeah,
that it's going to be a pretty rude awakening.
Oh yeah.
But I don't see how anybody can read Grimdark and then read this and think that, wow, he's crossed the lines. But at least it feels like there's a point.
I've read some Grimdark and I enjoy some Grimdark, but a lot of it is just, I guess, like Grimdark is edgy. It's like that thing, and there's a room for that. There's a space for that, and it's important. It's one of those things that we need to understand. Like we learn about boundaries and we learn about like rules by breaking them and crossing them and like testing them.
I was gonna say, because I feel like that's what Pynchon did. Was like part of it was about like, oh, there are these places I'm not supposed to go. I'm going to go as far into it as I can. I'm going to lean hard into that, right?
I feel like a lot of Pynchon for me is like him trying to see what he can get away with before like the serious literary critics finally dismiss him.
Yeah, so absolutely pushing boundaries is a part of it, but I think and that can have value on its own, or it can be entertaining in and of itself because it's unexpected.
Yeah.
But when people talk about like kind of a big point of these books is about subverting tropes, and I know that he very consciously subverts tropes with this series, but that it feels a bit reductive to me because he's not simply subverting tropes just to mess with the reader. Like, or for no purpose. He very much, he does it, but then he also uses it to make a point.
Yeah, very much. Like subverting tropes just for subverting tropes' sake is dumb. That's fun when you're 15, but that's not what's going to keep you awake at night forever.
So it's one of those things that always irked me a bit, and it's not because he doesn't do it, but it's just that like he's not just doing it to like Yeah, subverting for the sake of subverting. It's just is silly.
Exactly.
And this is not silly. I feel like it very much there's things to be drawn from the way in which he chooses to subvert them.
Yeah. Okay. Like before we like lose the thread completely, let's talk about the absence of sexuality with Tavor. I mean, there is obviously a relationship she has with Tamber in House of Chains, but still it's like very much made clear, like in every description of Tavor we get, that she has no like sexual attributes whatsoever anywhere. It's like very explicit in your face. And a lot of people I've just like watched I just watched Mike from Mike's book reviews, like thoughts on House of Chains, and he's like, Tavor is boring. Like, yeah.
Oh, I started that this morning. I didn't have time to finish it, but I think I got that far where he's like, yeah, I feel nothing for her. And to be fair, at that point in the book,
You don't.
there's not much to latch on to.
No. but I feel it's like what it does, once again, with like subverting tropes, there is when we usually have, we spoke about that earlier, right? That a lot of writers, especially in fantasy, like when they describe women, they're like very much focusing on their sexual attributes. Like, yeah, they have like what kind of breast size and shape they have, which is like,
Yeah.
Unless you're describing someone for like gratuitous sex scenes later, I really don't care that much about it.
I'm gonna inject something here, but and then we'll come back to the Tavor thing, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Just because there's so much talk of sort of the male gaze, right? And I want to break that down a little bit.
Yeah.
So in a book, and I think Martin in particular, George R. Martin is bad about this. But there are lots and lots of examples. Like if I am learning about a female character and her characteristics from either her point of view or an omniscient point of view, and there is all this thought and talk about breasts, that to me, that's going to immediately turn me off, or her other physical attributes, whatever they may be, right?
Yeah.
But if a male character within the books is admiring a female character within the books, I'm totally fine with it. It's not that there's and I'm only speaking for myself here, but it's not that there's an issue with the male gaze or male attractions or anything like that. It's the fact, it's this idea that gaze is the universal perspective. Because
like as a reader, like if it's the universal perspective, you as the reader are forced to take on that male gaze. And I agree with you, Martin is extremely bad. It's like one of the things, like when I first read it, the first Daenerys chapter, which is like her, like which begins with her being, prepared to meet Khal Drogo for the first time, and you have like the slave girls like bathing her, and it's all about her body. And then it's like where they perfume her. It's like one under on the nipple of each breast and one on her lips, down there between her legs. And I'm like, dude, the fuck. Was that necessary?
That is unnecessary. And I think that's where, or even just reference, and if you're read Wheel of Time, which is one of the most frustrating books ever when it comes to gender.
I have read The Eye of the World 3 times and never gotten beyond it because it made me so angry every single time.
Particularly because he intended to be addressing those issues, it's frustrating. But
I'm going to read it at some point.
Constantly adjusting or crossing their arms under or over or thinking about their breasts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, like this at the beginning, they're all just like annoying teenagers, but still.
So, and it got so frustrating for me. The only way I could go on reading was that anytime a woman thought about her breasts, I imagined Rand like readjusting his balls. Like I just inserted a line because really, it's the equivalent. When we're thinking about our, like, you know what I mean? Like it's if you're going to try and portray it from their point of view or from an omniscient point of view, then really this is just about,
Yeah.
There's no difference between sort of like,
Yeah,
adjusting your breasts and scratching your balls, really. Actually,
I can tell you. I can tell
that's
you.
one of the things I love it here is that there are many times when these things are discussed in a very not sexual way, where you've got the heavies like taking off their armor to like mop the sweat under their breasts.
Yeah.
Or men, and it's not just women, where you've also got men talking about like chafing as they sit in a saddle all day, or needing to readjust because they're in a painful position.
Yeah,
And I absolutely love that.
And it's so true. I have sat in the saddle all day, and yes, it chafes. It's not always nice.
Yeah, and it's sort of this ability to be able to think about our own bodies like in a practical way, and to have that portrayed in a way that actually reflects reality and isn't just this hypersexualized.
Yeah, to bring it actually back to like, yeah, these are just like parts of our body. They are like they are natural. And yeah,
And half
sometimes
the time, if you're thinking about them, it's because they're sweaty or itchy or
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's like sometimes you need to readjust your balls. Just
Exactly.
sorry, it can be really uncomfortable otherwise. And I'm pretty sure it's the same thing for breasts as well. It's like sometimes, but
yeah, it's because they're in the way, but really they don't get in the way that often, because you know what, they're just a part of your body, right? It's just, you don't think about it that much.
You don't think about it unless they start itching or sweating or something like that. And it's like, then you do something about it, and you're totally not thinking about it in like a sexual way. It's like, yeah, my balls itch.
Yeah, no, this is not titillating in any way. This is just
exactly.
Okay, so but this for some reason somehow started with you talking about Tavor. I don't even know how I got from there to
yeah, exactly.
I want to make sure we go back to that.
Yeah, we go back to Tavor. My idea is that Tavor, like the explicit description of how plain she is and how not sexually interesting or whatever she is, he once again does what we discussed earlier of like doing like the opposite of what we usually see in like fantasy literature. And that makes it so jarring, because when we look at Tavor being like, every time she's mentioned, it's all about her like not being attractive at all. It's like, yeah, but usually we totally skim over every description of like another attractive young female character, because that's like the only ones we get in fantasy books normally. So to actually make it explicit, the fact that like it's unnecessary to tell me how unattractive Tavor is most of the time, because it doesn't add anything in a lot of scenes, but it's always there, because on the other hand, with quote unquote attractive characters, it's also mentioned all the time.
So like you're thinking like with Malazan, or
yeah, well, Malazan it's not actually mentioned that often. I'm trying to say that
in other books.
In other books, yeah. In other books.
All right. Yeah. I'm like, that part threw me. Yes, yeah. I agree that if there's physical descriptions about attractiveness, it's to describe how attractive they are, or how hideous and therefore evil they are.
Exactly. I just wanted to say, like, jump in, and then you just said it. It's like, we only get like attractiveness or actual hideousness. Like the general like run-of-the-mill normal people looking normal never gets mentioned, and Malazan does that a lot. And I think that's like, for example, what we said earlier, that's what makes, for example, Tattersail so attractive in a way, that she's a regular person, and it's made very clear that she is that, but that she's still like absolutely attractive.
Well, because attraction in the real world is not limited to sort of what's been sold to us as the ideal.
Yeah, definitely.
If that were, 99% of us would just be out of luck, right?
Yeah. Except us, obviously, but yeah.
But seriously, that attraction is not this narrowly defined thing, or that there's only one type. That attraction can only exist when it falls within this mold.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
going back to Tavor, I think I talked about this before. In fact, it was the first time Erickson ever responded to one of my comments. It was a comment about Tavor.
Mhm.
And it's about the fact that I needed her to be a good guy from the very beginning, if that makes sense. And I know that this is not black and white, good or bad guys, but we're never really quite sure for most of the series, like what her end goal is.
Yeah.
We're never quite sure which side she lies on or what she's trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah.
And so there's always this question of like, is she going to betray the bone hunters? Is she we don't know what her deal is, basically.
Yeah.
And that I think almost from the very first introduction, I needed her to be the one to save the day, I guess. And
Yeah.
so it was incredibly satisfying to me, the ending, when she does sort of step up and we see what she's gone through and what she's suffered on behalf of her,
Mhm.
both her soldiers and the crippled god, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
But I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
The reason I felt so strongly about her is that we have a woman who is physically unattractive, ambitious, and intelligent. Like that is pretty much like
every man's nightmare.
Yeah, there's no way that she's portrayed positively. Like that is those are pretty much unforgivable sins when it comes to being a woman in the real world.
Definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
And I needed her to upend all of that, and God, did she deliver?
Yeah. That's true. I feel like the other part, what makes like her so in the end beloved by a lot of character, like a lot of readers, is that she kind of embodies the thing that a lot of us feel. Like most of us feel unattractive and overlooked a lot of the time, right? Like at least like, you know, the oddball people that read fantasy, we always feel like we're plain, no one notices us, but secretly we have the dream that we will save the day, and Tavor stands in for a lot of that by not being the superhero like in like looks or whatever, but just doing like her damnedest best to actually get the job done that needs to be done. And that's what she does so well.
I agree, and I feel like I know I bumped up against this idea with like other fantasy readers, but in general, like I it's really fun to read about the hero and the beautiful people that do the amazing things, right? That is fun and it's entertaining, but at
Yeah.
the end of the day, that isn't something I can identify with personally.
Which I feel is, on the other hand, what makes to talk about that book that Erickson never reads, or I mean, he has read it at this point, but still, which makes the Lord of the Rings so impressive, right? And made it so successful later on, because the main heroes of the Lord of the Rings, being Frodo and Sam, are also like very average people, especially Sam, who's like at this point probably like the most beloved hobbit of them all. Is like it's Sam, because he is the everyday guy who steps up even though he doesn't have to, but he has to, because it has to be done. And that's sort of like the thing that Tavor does as well. It's like, you realize there's a problem, you go ahead and you do everything to solve that, because even though you may not actually win, you do the right thing. In a way.
No, absolutely. It's very, I think there's something especially satisfying to see characters that are human, and maybe like you don't identify with them in that you feel like you're the same as them, but that you recognize them, you recognize pieces of yourself in them.
Yeah.
And then see them rise up to make a difference.
Yeah, which is both empowering and encouraging, because it means like, yeah, maybe we should actually do the same and get off our lazy asses and change the world.
I've been thinking a lot about that really, like if we want to call ourselves true Malazan fans, that like that that almost it feels like that some sort of activism goes hand in hand with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Definitely. Okay, like one thing that I want to touch on definitely was when we spoke about it like a little earlier, when we talked about like commodification and stuff. And this is like the other part of like when I totally didn't mention her when I mentioned Discoric is Felicin and prostitution.
Mm.
In
Yeah.
I mean, it's a darker topic, so if we don't want to touch it, that's
No,
fine. But I just feel it's like interesting to look at her and the
but
hate she gets as a character for the things she does.
it's what I'm trying to decide what to unpack, like why that portrayal is important, and also the reaction. I kind of feel like the reaction, oh, that's a conversation that's gone back and forth so many times. I want to start with why that particular portrayal is important,
Yeah,
because it seems to me when we talk about sex work and porn,
yeah,
that this shift away from victim blaming and into empowerment has become a conversation about choice,
yeah,
and that somehow engaging in these activities is an act of choice and embracing sexuality and empowerment. And I think that is really dangerous because it covers up a lot of ugliness.
yeah. I mean, I think
Uh,
like it's necessary to make that discussion and talk about the fact that for some people it is a choice,
yes.
and that's great. And we should not ever blame anyone for making that choice, but we should also look at the fact that some people maybe have like very few choices.
Yeah.
But on
Yeah,
the
I'm
other,
certainly not suggesting a return to victim blaming, but I also
no.
think that sometimes it's possible to go too far in the opposite direction and try and celebrate this, or make it seem, normalize it to an extent that we stop looking at the very real underlying issues, right?
Yeah,
Because I think where we have Shirk, who goes to work in a brothel purely for her own gratification, and
yeah,
like she's going to earn money and she's going to meet her needs at the same time, like that very much was a choice on her part. I
yeah.
think that Listen's experience is probably far more reflective.
But the other part of like her decision, and I feel that's like also important, and that gets lost a lot in like the discussion about her. And I feel Felicin is probably the character that is the most important in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because it is the one that unmasks so much of like readers' assumptions in one. But my point is that, and it's very clear in her like viewpoint parts, is like she consciously made that decision. I mean, I'm not saying that she didn't have like any other choice, but it feels to her that she decided to do that to actually do something good and help. And a lot of people talking about her are like totally devaluating that by saying like, yeah, but Hiboric would have helped her, and she's pushing him away, and Bodhi would have helped. But that's basically unseeing her and ignoring her as an actual agent who makes
Right.
that decision.
Why didn't she just sit back and let the men save her? Why
Yeah,
did she try and
yeah,
take action to make things better for them? That
yeah,
doesn't make sense. I
yeah.
do I need to make it very clear that was sarcasm?
Yeah. But yeah,
And that so many of the choices that we often tend to judge, like how easily it could be us in that situation, that when you are desperate, you take whatever path you see out. And
yeah,
that doesn't mean you see all the consequences. It's simply that in
yeah,
that moment, you're going to do whatever it takes to survive.
exactly.
And for her, that's how she saw it.
Yes, but it's important to be aware of the fact that she did that. She thinks of herself, and this is important. as
Yeah.
being the agent. And
Oh,
that's the bit you need. For me, I
yes.
feel it's important to respect her for being the agent and not giving up and letting things happen, to actually go and do it. It might be the wrong decision. It certainly is not a healthy decision, but it's very much her doing it and not letting anyone else take control.
I feel this. I feel the same way about Tavor and the
Yeah,
decision to send her there in the first place. Is
yeah,
that they both made the best decision they could from the options that they saw available at the
yeah,
time.
yeah.
Um, and I see what you're saying, because I do think that agency is important, and that first of all, there needs to be a level of respect for her
Yeah.
taking that agency and doing um, whatever she could to try
Mhm.
and save herself and those with her, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that celebrating empowerment and agency should not in turn lead to us denying or diminishing the underlying trauma,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That just because you chose it, just because this was a choice and she had the right to make that choice, doesn't mean that it wasn't trauma that led to her making that choice, and that there wasn't additional trauma caused by that choice.
Yeah. Those are
Um,
different
and,
things.
and so we can say yes, she has that choice, but we can also recognize that that doesn't make everything that happens to her okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I feel like a lot of like in the discussion about that part of it that we see is very much about her people are being uncomfortable with the fact, either uncomfortable with the fact that she has agency and actually does these things more or less consciously, and then either blaming her for doing that or just being uncomfortable with it and denying her agency by saying, you know, like you're either like super sorry for her or you really hate her for doing what she does, and there's like no in between, and it's not an, you know, black and white thing. Like the drive for us to, as people, I feel, to have agency in our lives is probably the most basic drive we have. And it leads to a lot of trauma and a lot of dumb, like really stupid decisions over time. Every day.
Absolutely. And I also think I feel like the part that bothers me the most with Felicin is sort of just this expectation that she should be grateful and kind.
Oh, she should be
That is
angry.
right. And she is angry. And I feel like, and she's not nice, and she makes really bad choices.
Yeah.
And she does it all from a place of pain. And that's the part that I feel like that is so wrapped up in
Mhm.
sort of this misogyny that I think most people are not aware of, and that is not when I talk about misogyny like this, it's in women just as much as men, because we're subjected to the same cultural input that
Yeah.
the rest of you know, that men are, right?
Yeah.
We've internalized this stuff just as well.
I
And
just love the fact that you're just like we're subjected to the same as the rest of you.
yeah, no, oh God, I have so much to say about that, because yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, okay, no, I won't go there. Sorry. But the minute it came out of my mouth, like that's part of it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
There's so much part of it. Uh, this woman is something other.
Yeah.
Um, and and that it's something that women have as well as men,
Yeah. Because
right?
it's in there all the time. It's like in every like it's in our language. It's in our like all of like our culture. It's so deeply ingrained at this point that yeah, it's like you think like male being male is the norm basically. Everything else is seen as other. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so this idea that, I mean, okay, I would kind of go back to what you were talking about earlier, that like that often for men, there's this sense of a loss of power when you're not the one to pursue.
Yeah.
Right. And that for women, this expectation that you should sit back and let men make the decisions and save you from, and then be grateful for it.
Yeah.
I think is the flip side of that. This surrender instead of pursuit, right?
Yeah.
And she doesn't do that.
No, she doesn't. Which may just be a general Paran trait, because none of the Paran siblings ever sits back. They always get pissed off if someone else tries to make decisions for them.
Yes, I was thinking that too, that the agency is something that is we see in all three. And this sort of pushing back against expectations. Oh, you expect me to do that? Well, I'm going to go do the opposite then.
It's something that I very, very much understand, because I'm very much like that myself. It's like, you tell me to do something, I will certainly not do it. And the other way around, but yeah. But yeah.
I feel like to some extent, it does feel like we've kind of veered all over the place and gotten off topic. And yet, when you first suggested discussing this, and I started thinking about sex in these books, and there are a lot of other things we could talk, but it felt so entwined with gender issues for me. Like it was really hard for me to separate.
Because it is entwined with it all the time. And that's the problem, right? I mean, what we said earlier, that sex is so intertwined with love and commitment, and you said that also with gender. It's like, yes, and we need to untangle those things, because those are different issues, and looking at them separately helps a lot, because we can solve like the actual issues and then concentrate on the other stuff to get it right.
Yeah, it helps. Yes, it does. It helps to separate them out and see like where have we think of this as something related to sex when actually it's an issue related to gender, or vice versa, or that really this is about ideas of romance or commitment and monogamy. And
ideas of romance are once again like linked to ideas of gender for whatever reasons.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that the few times we see what are sort of kind of maybe more typical romance, how often that is tied to, I don't know, I'm thinking of Darujhistan in particular, and Chalice, where it's sort of more traditional, and it doesn't, and it's ridiculous, and it's sort of reserved for the young. Crocus and Apsalar are another example, where these romantic notions of crocuses have actually nothing to do with reality.
But he's 15 or whatever when he's 18, right? But still, like,
I've given up trying to figure out people's ages.
He's a kid, though. I mean, that's like the point. And I feel that's like another thing that there. Then we go back to what you wanted to say, because I have like had this thought and I want to drop it first. Especially also with Felicine. She's 15 when that shit happens. Mm-hmm. None of us made good choices when we were 15. And we had like much better circumstances. It's like when 15-year-old people are not good at thinking about consequences. Mm-hmm. In general, that's not how that works. So, and I feel like a lot of like fantasy readers, especially with Malazan, which has a more mature readership, like people that are older most of the time, we tend to assume like with our our characters, that they have like the same way of thinking about things that we have in a way. And that's definitely wrong when you look at someone who's 15. It's like, when I was 15, I was an idiot. I mean, I still am, but in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think, all right, I'm gonna agree with you. Leave it there.
It was the same with when I read Gardens of the Moon. It's like, I was so pissed off at Crocus all the time. And then I was like, oh, but seriously, when I was like 16, 17, I was like, I'm not saying that I was like Crocus, but I had like very skewed notions of love and romance and stuff like that. It's like, you need to figure that shit out over time. It's,
I hear that a lot, and maybe it's in part because I think in general, the fan base, at least the active fan base online, tends to skew heavily male.
yeah,
Because it's not something that hit me the first, like that's not something that emotionally resonates with me. But man, Crocus makes a lot of fans, like I think, have that same reaction because they see their younger stupid selves in Crocus.
yeah.
It's sort of like Poor says we could go back in the past and find yourself as a child and like just slap him.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, you wanted to talk about like the Crocus romance ideas and the Absalar, sorry, romance ideas.
Oh, I don't know that I wanted to go in detail. I just think that it's telling that where we see more typical romance, it's with younger characters. This sort of idea that this equation between romance and naivete, right? Like that sort of romance is this naive idea of love and sex and relationships and what that's going to be like, and has nothing to do with the reality, and is sort of reserved for the young, I guess.
Yeah. Although, and this is like the interesting thing, Crocus and Absalar, sorry, / we never actually learn her actual name. They get their happy end, right?
They do, but they don't. I think in large part that was because it's not that there wasn't love, but I think Crocus needed to let go a lot of a lot of those romantic ideas and ideas about love and who she was as his love interest.
Yeah,
to get there.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, that's the point. Is like they find love at the end once they've, at least Crocus has gone through a lot and become like a much more like mature person. I feel like the idea is like romance does exist, but it changes over time. At the beginning, you see like romance being like the goal and like this all over thing. And then over time, you realize that other parts of like relationships are more important. And once you worked out those things, romance is kind of the byproduct that happens. And then you have those like romantic moments and you're like, wow, this is great. But you can't set like romance as the goal. It's like an emergent quality, so to speak, of a good relationship.
And maybe we should separate sort of that idea of like romance as sort of this manufactured process and what's actually romantic, because there are many romantic moments in the series.
Definitely.
That are really satisfying. And oddly, a lot of them come in the last 2 books.
Yeah, true.
Like there's all this fighting and dying and depressing stuff going on, and maybe that's why, because that's part of it, is being in those extreme situations leads people to have extreme feelings and follow through on that because they don't know how much time they have left. But there's a lot of there are a lot of little romances and a lot of really great moments between characters in those last 2 books.
Definitely. I mean, like the other part there, I guess, is that what happens, especially during those last 2 books, is that a lot of like the protective measures that society enforces on us, right? Like, I mean, a lot of like being in society is very much, as a human being, is very much about like building up all these like walls of protection and distance, like emotional distance to the rest of the world. And those extreme circumstances in the last 2 books, they peel away everything, like like literally, because they are walking into the desert outside of society. But like also like on like an emotional level, they are tearing down all those masks and barriers and protective measures we built up just to be able to function in society. I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm just saying we need those in like everyday life. But once you take those away, you can focus on like the really important things. And those are like raw emotions. And those are terrible emotions sometimes, but they're also like a lot of times stuff like romance. You actually act on your impulses, which you never do in society. You don't do that because the consequences, you think about the consequences all the time.
That's a really good point. And I wonder if that's part of why those storylines, not only that we see them coming up more in the end of those books, but why they're so satisfying, because we see, I mean, what you're talking about, that sort of building that armor, that's something we see gosh, in just about every character in these books.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then to have these moments where they let that down and let another person in, it's so much more powerful, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, that other piece we didn't talk about, and I know we've been talking for a while, I don't know how long, but
about 2 hours at this point.
Oh God, okay. Well, we don't necessarily have to go into it, but I was just thinking like how childbirth and child rearing plays into this. Because obviously pregnancy and children is directly related to sex, even though we really do love to try and separate those things. One is actually the consequence of the other.
We're not going to say which one is which.
No, I'll leave that up to you to figure out.
You can figure it out yourself. Yeah, but yeah, you're right. And like, I feel like childbirth, yes, childbirth and child rearing, definitely. But it might just be in like a large enough topic in itself, because I feel the more I read Stephen Erickson, the more I feel that like child-parent relationships are one of the main themes of his writing all the time, all over the place.
Yeah.
Both on the positive and on the negative side. So they might just be, that might just be enough for like another 2-hour talk in itself.
Absolutely. There's so many things that we've just sort of touched on today that you could dig in so much deeper.
Yeah.
And that's definitely one of them. And yeah, it's been 2 hours, so maybe we call it.
Yeah, I think that's like a good idea to actually end it here for now. And I, once again, thank you for coming on. It was so much fun.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it was fun. I came in sort of not knowing where this conversation was going to go or end up, and we were all over the place. But it's such a fun topic to dig into, explore. I had a lot of fun. So thanks for hanging out and chatting with me.
Yeah, awesome.